like the libertarian sort of.
Exactly, precisely.
Mm-hmm. He actually had me because he knew it was my first time because it's so brand new.
Yeah.
I was trying to bring.
Good evening, everybody. Hello. I'm Pastor Max Lynn, pastor of St. John's Presbyterian Church. Welcome. Welcome to the panelists. Thank you for being here. So it's an honor to host the event, another civil liberties event. We are firm believers in a free speech and free press and free dialogue, so we're excited about this. I want to thank Bob Jaffe for behind me here, who has done a bunch of work for this. Great work. I want to just point out two things that are going on. You should have gotten a green piece of paper flyer for our December 19th event. It's a Friday, the Friday before Christmas. I think it's also Hanukkah. Horrible night. But we happen to, Catherine Hayhoe, who is the director of climate science at Texas Tech, is going to be in town and agreed to come over here and speak with us that evening. We are concerned about the disconnect between faith and the environment, or people who are concerned. The media seems to be missing those people of faith who are concerned and are working. And pretty quick to point out all the wackos who, well, you know who they are. And we want to counteract that a little bit by talking about people of faith who are scientists and what we can do, regardless of our spiritual background, what we can do to improve the situation with regard to climate change. So I hope you will come back and be a part of that. It should be excellent. We have two other great speakers. Excellent. Ron Amundsen just finished his stint as chair of the Environmental Sciences Department at Cal, and Dick Norgard, who is a very popular teacher who has taught a class at both Cal and Graduate Theological Union on religion, science, and ecology. The other thing I just want to let you know, you may have known that St. John's was one of the first founding churches, synagogue, faith communities of the sanctuary movement back in the 80s. A couple of weeks ago, we just made a recommitment because we have all sorts of children and minors and folks who are coming across the border. They're fleeing for their lives, and they're being called illegal, designated as other, and sent back. And we had a fellow church, a fellow pastor, who just had a bunch of minors and immigrants coming and just asking for help, and he just couldn't handle the need. And so he sent out an email and said, hey, I need help. So we went over and listened to the stories of a couple of the people, and the stories are horrendous. So I don't know if you have heard about what's going on, but there's about, in Guatemala, just one example, in Guatemala there's about 30 departments, more or less. Departments are like counties in the whole country. And in 7 of those counties, the police have just packed up shop and left. They have said, we cannot protect our own lives, much less the lives of the people. So basically, drug cartels have taken over. They literally are the government. They're raping at will, they're pillaging, they're brutalizing people, and people are sending their children. And I was reading scripture one day, getting ready to preach, and it was that day happened to be, we were reading about Moses. And so Moses' mom gives birth to Moses, and Pharaoh says he wants to kill all the babies, and so she hides them for 2 months. When she can't hide them anymore, she puts them in a basket in the river and pushes them across. And I think, man, we have babies who are being put in baskets and pushed across the river, not the Nile, but the Rio Grande. And if that basket floats to us, what are we going to do? So I want to ask you, in whatever your community is, wherever you work, whatever, if it's a faith community or whatever, any community, an activist community, maybe you can participate as well in Sanctuary. There are thousands of children who need help, and we need to tell the story, change the policy, and make a difference. So I hope that you would join along and be a big help. I'm just going to offer the blessing, the AA blessing, or it's attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr, that God would give us the courage to change those things that should be changed, the grace to accept those things that cannot be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Pastor Max. It's a pleasure to come back. This is our third forum of civil liberties here at St. John's. And our first forum was June 11, 2013, which was 2 days after the amazing revelations by Edward Snowden concerning the NSA and the... Can everybody hear me? Okay. So this is the third in our series, and continuing forums will happen here, and it'll be on media, the new media. There's a lot of ground to cover. Before we get into today's event, I just want to make sure everybody knows about the sign-up sheets that hopefully have been distributed here, so that if you want to be on the emailing list of these various organizations that do great activist work, sign up for that. There should also be on each of your seats a question card or a pink slip, okay? And that's for our there's a gentleman back there who's holding up a question card, and here's a pink slip. Good, you all got them. Excellent. So we're going to get to question and answers, which I think is really important tonight. We'll get to question and answers hopefully about 10 to 9. I know a lot of you have questions, especially about the last election that just took place. I do. Finally, this event tonight is a fundraiser for one of our activist organizations, which is rootsaction.org, represented by Norman Solomon, one of our speakers. Norman has been a speaker at our first two events, as has Dan Ellsberg. So they're the homies, the home team. And we're hoping they keep coming home because they make great contributions. Our first event was, as I said before, it was 2 days after the Snowden revelations. There were TV sound trucks double parked outside because it was a shocking revelation that Edward Snowden had made about the outreach of surveillance in this country, the amount and extent of surveillance of everyone in this country, at least their telephone records. There were other programs that were talked about that were revealed by Snowden, programs that we had absolutely no idea of. Many of these programs had been okayed in a court, a secret court called the FISA court, and those court orders allowed the NSA to do massive surveillance in this country and also in Europe. It was medical records, it was diplomats, it was telephone records, commercial records, it was everything that they could get. And Snowden had been a contractor for Booz Allen, or an employee of Booz Allen, and appalled by the amount of surveillance that was both illegal or unauthorized or authorized in a secret court, that he disclosed all of these programs, or at least the ones that he had access to. And it caused a shockwave in this country, a shockwave around the world, a a debate in this country that absolutely needed to take place, but could not have taken place without the revelations of Edward Snowden. Alongside Edward Snowden had grown a media, an independent media, that was the UK Guardian that broke the story. It was Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras. These names are familiar to you by now, okay? And so what made Snowden's disclosures all the more powerful was this independent media that had grown up alongside the whistleblowers, okay? So that's what we're going to get into tonight. We're going to explore the notion of media. It's beyond what we traditionally think of as media, of newspapers. It's billboards, it's the internet, it's live streaming. We're live streaming tonight, okay? So we're on television. We're part of the media tonight. We are. And the music, too, is the media. There's rap music. There's an oratorio that was written about Chelsea Manning and his story. So the media has really broadened. So it's independent media and whistleblowers, investigative journalists, that are acting as a check on government power. And as we've seen in the election, we no longer have to complain about a partisan Congress, do we? Okay? Because we've had an avalanche. So we now have a Congress that is not partisan gridlocked at all. And that's a brand new problem for us. So let me introduce the speakers, and we'll get to the questions. We're going to have one question tonight to save time. So our first speaker is, our home team, is Daniel Ellsberg, who is well known to all of us as an activist, an author, the Pentagon Papers that he released back in 1968. I was in my second year of law school when Dan introduced the Pentagon Papers, which brought the war to an end. One of my favorite stories about Dan Ellsberg is he attended the trial of Chelsea Manning at Fort Meade, Maryland. It was just in the last year or two. He stood outside the fence as a protester for much of the time. He got in also. But that's Dan Ellsberg. He'll be our first speaker. Our next speaker is Norman Solomon, who's also well known to our panel down at the end, who is author, filmmaker, activist, co-founder of RootsAction.org, coordinator of ExposeFacts.org. Norm will be speaking on the war on journalists and what we can do about it. Our next speaker, next to Norman, is Trevor Timm, who is the executive director of Freedom of Press Foundation. And Trevor has a unique role, a very pivotal role in what he does, and he's going to explain to us exactly what Freedom of Press does. And also to go into possibilities of reforming the NSA legislation and a consideration of what Snowden's contribution was in this whole process. We have Ahmed Ghappour, professor of law at Hastings. Ahmed tells me that he was Guantanamo Defense Counsel. Bravo for you. And he was also the lead counsel for Barrett Brown. We're going to hear about Barrett Brown, the case against Barrett Brown. And I believe I said you were a graduate of Hastings, did I not? Did I mention that?
NYU.
NYU, but you're a professor of law at Hastings. There you go. Excellent. And our Last speaker that will provide the finale is Marjorie Cohn, professor of law at Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego, former president of the National Lawyers Guild, author of many books, and you've written some really interesting blogs about what's going on in this country, and you'll provide us with the finale concerning what we, the people, can do. Okay, so that's our panel. We'll go now to the first question. And this is for Dan Ellsberg. We have 9 minutes. Dan, please give us a brief history of the principles of constitutional checks and balances, referencing your own experience as a whistleblower. Trace for us the modern development of Bill Binney, Tom Drake, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, the linkage between whistleblowers and new media.
9 minutes, right?
9 minutes.
Okay. Well, the history of checks and balances starts, I believe, with Montesquieu. Let's talk about that for 8 or 9 minutes. Okay. The idea of checks and balances obviously was, as Jefferson and Madison put it out at the time of the constitutional debates in Adams, was that we don't have a government of angels, we have a government of men. It was only exclusively men in those days, of course, who were fallible and could be counted on to lie when it suited them if they could get away with it, and to abuse powers that were given to them, again, if they could get away with it. And that the way to oppose that, as Montesquieu had suggested and others, was to have several branches of government so that you would oppose men of interest with other men of interest, with their own ambitions and their own constituencies and their own conditions for retaining office and power. I just recently, to my surprise, that it was so recently, came across a quotation from James Madison, the author of the First Amendment, saying that it was the intention of the freedom of speech protection in the First Amendment, which he had drafted, to make something of a fourth branch of government to the press so that they could hold the other branches accountable and be a check on the other branches. Are you all familiar? I had not seen that precise point made before by one of the founders. Well, how has that been working out? About as well as the other checks and balances, which is in the context, of course, of the current administration and the preceding one, which have acted in the field of foreign policy, foreign affairs, war, and peace, as if they have no restraint whatever on executive power. And our own Berkeley tenured professor, John Yoo, the constitutional professor, whose views seem to be not unlike those of the other constitutional lawyer in the White House right now, is that an absurd view, as Yoo, Y-O-O, puts it, that it was the intention of the founders to give the president essentially the powers of the King of England when it came to war and peace. An astonishing statement for someone who was favored with tenure at this university here, since it was nothing could be clearer, even to a layman like myself, than that it was the intention to deprive any one man, and specifically the president and the executive, of those prerogative powers of the King of England when it came to getting us into war. But not only when it came to getting into war, as in Libya or now Syria. Remember that Libya was defined by another law professor, the dean, I think, of Duke, wasn't it? Who was very critical of the Bush administration. I'm talking about Harold Koh, K-O-H, who was very critical of the Bush administration's pretenses in this area when he was a law professor, and denounced his former student, John Yoo, Y-O-O. And then as soon as he began working for Obama as counsel for the State Department, defined the Libyan attacks by drones, and I point to Marjorie because she's just published a very good book on drones and the legality, that is the illegality of most of our drone operations. It wasn't a war, so he didn't have to go to Congress. The Article 1, Section 8 didn't apply because no American lives were at stake. I didn't see a lot of challenge of that constitutional opinion by either the media or, for that matter, most people in Congress, with the exception, I think, of Rand Paul, of all people, who was following in the footsteps of Ron Paul, was clear on that subject. His father, Ron Paul, by the way, I have a warm spot for in this area. I think he's the only member of Congress who has ever referred to me approvingly on the floor of Congress that I'd done the right thing here. And it's consistent with his other views on civil liberties. So now in Syria, the constitutional issue is not raised. The president is thinking of going to Congress for consent to that some months after we start killing people in Syria with drones and air attacks. But in the area of detention, of rendition, that is kidnapping, suspension essentially of habeas corpus, assassination by drones and other things, the president, starting with Bush, but really George W. Bush, but also President Obama, have essentially said or acted on the assumption that they can act without any restraint by Congress, the courts, legislation, treaties, or the Constitution. Actually, get beyond that. In other words, again, what Madison called, to quote him again, the very definition of tyranny, namely the concentration of legislative, executive, and judicial power in one group, not just in one man, but in an executive branch. We also have an executive branch, one branch of the four, three or four, that has the surveillance capability now, which is it as exercising, to know all the private communications of all members of the other branches, along with everyone else in the country. But all the staff in Congress, all the chairpersons, like Dianne Feinstein, all their home and office phones and emails, everything about them. And the sources. People say, I don't have anything to hide. What's the problem? But journalists do have something to hide if they are possibly to act as investigative checks and balances and hold accountability, namely their sources. The same would be true of Congress if they held investigative hearings anymore, which has practically gone into abeyance entirely. So we are getting then a pretty total absence of checks and balances, and the very possibility of investigative reporting, which relies on an anonymity of sources which no reporter can honestly guarantee to a source anymore. Very serious situation, but I don't find this entirely, I mean, the issue is not just governmental lying and governmental usurpation of power, but also there is another dimension to this, and you were talking about the media tonight. When Ben Bradley died of the Washington Post, just on roughly, what was it, October 22nd, I believe, the Post reprinted a speech that he had given as a memorial to him in 1997, just the day after he died. And he starts out by referring, and refers actually throughout, to the Pentagon Papers. He gives an example of governmental lying, and then he says, but wonder of wonders, he says, this is Bradley, 7 years later, the Pentagon Papers were published showing the reality of what was really said and what was really being done and how different that was. And he ends the speech, actually, by saying, in a democracy, he gives some other examples of a similar nature. In a democracy, the truth emerges. Sometimes it takes years, and that is how the system is supposed to work and eventually strengthen itself. Next sentence. I take great strength from that now, knowing that in my experience, the truth does emerge. It takes forever sometimes, but it does emerge. Now, it was a disaster that it took 7 years for the truths he's describing to emerge. And that was not only a factor of government secrecy, but an egregious failure by the media to act in this, as Madison foresaw, possibly as a fourth branch of government, holding them accountable. he hints at that at some point when saying, he talks about the lies, and he said, supposing this had been known 7 years earlier, and so forth. Think of, this is a direct quote now, the thousands of American lives and the thousands of Vietnamese lives that would have been saved. Indeed, well, one little problem with media reporting of our wars, which start very often secretly but become overt, is that when he says thousands of Vietnamese lives, which is very typical of reporting by the journals, he's underestimating by 1,000 times, not 1,000%, the millions of lives that were lost in Vietnam. McNamara, the man he's quoting is a liar, estimated as 3 or 4 million. A million is 1,000,000. Yes, there were 58,000, not just thousands of American lives. You can call that, not thousands of American lives, but millions of Vietnamese lives. In Iraq, in all of our reporting in the media, they are content to quote George W. Bush and others talking about 40,000 civilian deaths. How about 1.5 million, which was what several independent studies have come up with, and figure the factor there. How curious is the public about that? Well, we have a shortcoming of the democratic public on this point, you could say. But every time that there is a leak or some documents are given, as Bradley was finally given the Pentagon Papers, the question really does arise, should arise in the media's mind, and as far as I can tell, never does. Why didn't we find this out earlier? Where were we on this? What lies did we print unquestioningly years ago, and who told them to us? And what do they say now if we were to go back to them? Now, most of these people were no longer in office. They were in no way held accountable. But in the case of George W. Bush and even of Obama, some of them still really are in office. And when the lies come out, does a reporter really ever go back and say to one of those people, no, if they're still in office, he or she needs them as a source, needs the access, does not want his newspaper, her newspaper, to be cut off from that access. More leaks. Actually, what we have here, what I'm saying is, truth to come out after 7 years of bombing is not how the system is supposed to work. Exactly. And it is a failure of every one of those branches of government, you could say, least of all the executive in a certain sense, because the executive branch in every country, dictator or democracy or what, is the one that's most interested in war, the one most responsive to the military interests and the defense industry interests and so forth, and the one that lies. They're doing what they do. And our government, the system was supposed to work in a way that reined in that power. That's the whole basis of it. And it is not working. I think that when Bradley said in 1997, and it's reprinted now admiringly by the Post, I take great strength from that now. It does emerge. It shows a complacency and an acceptance of the way this system is working that is absolutely discreditable, unwarranted, and irresponsible. The system has to change.
Dan, could you just end your portion here with talking briefly about the linkage between whistleblowers and the independent media? Because that's...
Well, yes, okay. First of all, as I say, he's taking a lot of credit, which is to some degree deserved, that they printed the Pentagon Papers back in 1971. And indeed, they've never taken credit for something that was unprecedented in any country, ever. And that was that 19 newspapers, not just the Post and the Washington Times, and the Washington Post and the New York Times, 19 newspapers defied the Attorney General of the United States and the President, who were both saying that any further printing needed to be enjoined and was a danger, an irreparable danger to the defense of the country during a war. 19 of them defied that in a wave of civil disobedience, which would make them shudder, and their publishers shudder to civil disobedience. No, that's what it was, basically, and it had never been done before, and I'm sorry to say it's never really been done again. But now, with the independent media that you talk about, and the internet, of course, whereas I put out 7,000 pages, which was couldn't have been done without the lead cutting-edge technology of the day, Xerox, like that. But of course, Chelsea Manning could not have put out hundreds of thousands of cables without the digital revolution and the access to the internet that WikiLeaks gave him, and which WikiLeaks then gave to a number of newspapers so that they would compete, and none would hold it back because they knew the others would beat them. The way, for example, that the New York Times held back on request of the White House the story about the surveillance for a full year until Risen was coming out of it. Coming back, I would say it again. It's outrageous that we're 40 years between the publication of the Pentagon Papers and Chelsea Manning, the first person to put out papers on a comparable scale and of importance. Now, 3 years later, yes, very good, Snowden took advantage of the example of Manning, which meant that he stayed out of the country in order to put out his digital reports, so that he's not in an isolation cell the way Manning was for 10.5 months then. That couldn't have been done without the current digital process, but it does show we don't have too many whistleblowers. 3 in 43 years is really not too many. 1 of those a year might be about right, if not once a month somewhere in the world. And we need more, and the more have to come out with a totally different culture of accountability for the officials, for Congress people like Udall and Wyden, who knew the surveillance and opposed it and regarded it as unconstitutional, but kept their mouths shut so they would not lose their place on the Intelligence Committee, and in the media, to hold them accountable for the fact that they have gone along with this stuff for so many years.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker. Our next speaker is Norman Solomon. I'll read his question. Incidentally, the panelists already have their questions, so they don't have to remember everything that I'm asking them. So, Norman, along with Marcy Wheeler, you wrote an article in The Nation magazine outlining the Obama administration's war against journalists, in particular James Risen. Discuss this case in greater detail with reference to the DOJ's position and the current case status. You also are a coordinator of exposefacts.org. Explain the background of this organization and what it does, and talk about the linkage between leaguers and the media.
Well, in so many ways, the gravity and reality of our situation is hidden in plain sight. And that's, I think, the case with now 7 years of subpoenas against James Risen. To the extent there has been mass media coverage, it has pretty much focused on Risen. As a matter of fact, if you saw 60 Minutes a few weeks ago, where Risen was featured, there was an invisible man who was unmentioned, which is the CIA officer being prosecuted, who Risen is heroically refusing to answer questions about. The Justice Department wants Risen to name or identify, I should say, this individual, Jeffrey Sterling, as his source in his book about a botched and dangerous CIA operation giving flawed blueprints to Iran back in year 2000. So here you've got this situation which is both fairly outrageous on its face, but also a metaphor where 60 Minutes spends a sizable segment on James Risen talking about how he may go to prison for not giving testimony against someone, but the people watching wouldn't have the foggiest notion from the coverage about who that someone is. Because the whistleblower, and he is a whistleblower whether the indictment is accurate or not, because he went to the Senate Intelligence Committee with his concerns about the CIA operation, this whistleblower, Jeffrey Sterling, is a non-person in the media. He is the invisible man in this case. And that's not atypical, it's not anomaly. In point of fact, precisely what the mass media, with few exceptions, elides and avoids, precisely what the people in power know but don't want to acknowledge, is that whistleblowing and independent journalism desperately need each other. That in effect, we will only get the official story unless we have thriving independent journalism and thriving whistleblowing. And it is that specter of the possibility, faint although it might seem, to have the informed consent of the governed, that would be a very dangerous situation to the military-industrial surveillance complex, because it, I think, becomes more and more clear, and the rise in Sterling legal situations pointed up, is that there is a very clear, fervent goal coming from the Obama administration, as was also the case under the Bush administration. Their goal is the uninformed consent of the governed. Now, what would that mean, the uninformed consent of the governed? It's sort of like what we're told how you grow mushrooms. You keep them in the dark and you feed them bullshit. Well, that's the view of the way the public should be dealt with, is they don't need to know. They don't need to know anything that the government doesn't want. As a matter of fact, they should not know anything except what the government wants them to know. So if you can have the uninformed consent of the governed, which is just to say go along, then that is just a nirvana for the people running the so-called national security state. But of course it's a nightmare for anybody who wants anything approximating democracy. When Marcy Wheeler and I looked into this in some detail, one of the most striking things to me was that not only the Obama administration's official position with the U.S. Supreme Court, that there is no reporter's journalistic privilege whatsoever for confidentiality, that journalists have the responsibility, the legal responsibility under penalty of law to name their sources whenever the government wants them to. And by the way, the same position is being taken by the British government. Different set of laws, same arrogant attitude. But it's not only that. Something else that was very striking to me is that in a court filing almost 4 years ago, the Obama Justice Department said that whistleblowing is apt to be worse than spying for a foreign government. Apt to be worse. And at first glance I thought, well, how could that be? Are they, have they taken leave of their senses? Was it a slip? No, it's been the official position legally for several years now. And when you step back and you look at it, the reasons, as so much of this, are hidden in plain sight. And that is that if you have a spy for Russia or China giving secrets to those governments about U.S. classified information, then that government of that one country will find out. But if you have a whistleblower, the entire world's going to find out. So of course that's the ultimate worst possibility. And in many ways, you know, our situation now is to make the worst nightmare of the U.S. national security state come true. And that is actual democracy. That is the informed consent of the governed, which requires whistleblowers and journalists not only to be tolerated, but to be affirmed and supported. I think it does come down, you know, there are many ways to say it, but when you have the uninformed involvement, if you can put it that way, of people in the United States, then democracy just sort of floats away into the sky, and we have left pretty much what we have right now. I don't want to take a lot of time going into the details of the case, and if you take a look at it on the Nation website, and we go into some detail. But I do want to say that we have a really remarkable consistent position from the Justice Department, which is enormous hostility towards any reporting that is counter to the White House view of what should be known, particularly by the public, particularly in the areas of so-called national security. But the Risen case, the Sterling case, they are not anomalies in any way. Let's keep in mind that the phone contacts of about 100 Associated Press reporters were compromised intentionally by the Obama Justice Department when the phone logs and records were monitored without informing Associated Press. 20 different phone lines used over an extended period of time. And the recognition that confidentiality of sources is essential for journalism worthy of its name, it's a recognition that's crystal clear to the people who are determined to manage the flow of information and to block the flow of information. But in many ways, at the grassroots, it's just sort of dawning on a whole lot of us. And I think that it's an actionable item, you might say. If we're going to lose, I think Bob and I were talking about a year ago, and we were talking about one of these panels, and Bob said, I want my Bill of Rights back. And I think that is an appropriate position to take. It's a good metaphor if we look at the body politic. How does the human body survive? It requires circulation. It requires the flow throughout the body politic. But in the United States of America, we have the equivalent of serial coronary attacks. We have blockages. We have institutional structural frameworks that, on a regular, routine basis, intentionally block the flow of information, let alone ideas, commentary, analysis, and debate. So the issues of journalism and whistleblowers, I believe, really cut across all sorts of concerns. The Washington bureau chief of Associated Press was saying recently that the AP reporter in charge of covering the transportation department is now told by employees of that department that if any of those employees talk to the reporter, he or she, the employees, will be fired. And this is being taken as a model in the public and the private sector, at the state level, at the county level, at the municipal level. And so without freaking out about it, I think we need to come to grips with the reality that it is a double-barreled assault on democracy, where whistleblowers and journalists are in the crosshairs of this administration, and there is no indication that that attitude and that set of policies is going to change unless we can alter the political power that exists in this country. And I think I'll close on that note. We were in this room, 15, 16 months ago, as you mentioned, Bob, right after the revelations first started to come out, courtesy of one of the great whistleblowers, Edward Snowden. And in retrospect, I think we can say that not only because of him, not only because of Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald and others, but because so many people grasped the opportunity to take that information and run with it and interpret it and disseminate it. We have had a tremendous success in changing people's awareness and understanding, massive national and global education about the surveillance state and its intersection with the warfare state and so forth. So that's been a huge triumph. Journalistically as well, it's been a tremendous success where many media institutions, particularly the independent ones, have stepped to the fore and in many ways forced the more hidebound media outlets to at least trot up behind and try to stay within shouting distance. great journalistic success. What about political power? 16 months later, I think we could say realistically that we have had tremendous failure on the basis of political power to respond appropriately and effectively to the information that Snowden made public. And that's really a lot of our challenge ahead. You look at the people running the U.S. House and Senate, you look at the people running the executive branch and those who are mostly in the judicial branch sitting on their hands and essentially saying, well, you know, that's not something we want to get into. It's up to the executive branch unless Congress steps in. That's essentially the status quo that we have going. And we have not been able to find ways to change that dynamic. I think it's very clear, forget about next year, but this year, it's very clear that the majorities in the House and the Senate have no intention of disturbing the stranglehold on the body politic that the NSAs and the CIAs and their huge multi-billion-dollar contractors, that chokehold that they have is very secure. And they have the power, and we have the potential at the grassroots to galvanize our own power, but so far it's unrealized.
Okay, thank you. We'll have time for questions. We'll have time for questions at the break. Trevor, Timm, you are the Executive Director of Freedom of the Press Foundation. Briefly discuss your organization and its very unique board of directors. What role does it play in media and whistleblowers? As a columnist for the UK Guardian, you wrote optimistically in your column of June 2014 about the chances of NSA reform. Discuss these reforms and particularize the contribution of Edward Snowden. Would we have reform of the NSA without Snowden's leaks? You got your question in front of you, so go ahead.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. So I was blessed to co-found Freedom of the Press Foundation in 2012 with two of my true heroes, one of which is sitting 3 seats down from me, Mr. Dan Ellsberg, and the other, who's actually here in the audience tonight too, the founder of EFF, J.P. Barlow. And we originally had this idea or this inspiration for this organization to help WikiLeaks get past the financial blockade. So, you may remember in 2011, after they started publishing classified information along with The Guardian and The New York Times, they were cut off from Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal, essentially financially censored, while they were doing the same thing, essentially the same thing that newspapers all across the country do all the time. And we thought this was an end run around the First Amendment. You know, they were pressured unofficially by government officials to do something that they never would have been able to get away with if they went to court. And so we started taking donations to WikiLeaks, but we wanted the organization to be something much broader and much more principled than just about one organization. And it was our goal to advocate for a more adversarial press and to teach the public about the rights of whistleblowers and the fact that the press can't really exist without the ability of whistleblowers to come to them with information that's in the public interest. And so we started this organization around December 2012, which also happens to be the date that Edward Snowden first started to contact Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras were also two of our founding board members. And after Ed was unable to contact Glenn, get him over an encrypted channel on the internet, he ended up finding our webpage and saw that Laura Poitras was also connected to Glenn Greenwald and a couple of other, or actually another staff member of ours, Michael Lee, who is our kind of encryption guru, who we had been sending out all over the place to teach journalists, including Glenn and Laura, how to better use this type of technology to protect their sources. And And from there, the rest is history. And a few months later, on June 5th, the Edward Snowden revelations started. And so we are, obviously immensely proud to be a small part of what has happened over the past year and a half. And actually, earlier this year, Edward Snowden actually joined our board of directors as well, and has a huge. And hopefully he can contribute to the public debate for years to come. But the other thing I want to talk about tonight is how big of an impact he has had on this debate. Because before I was with Freedom of the Press Foundation, I was at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. And EFF has been suing the NSA since at least 2006. So far before the Edward Snowden revelations, we had known a lot of this was happening from other whistleblowers like Mark Klein, who's also from the Bay Area, the AT&T whistleblower, and William Binney and Thomas Drake and others. And the way that things have gone in the past year and a half could not be any more different than what had come in previous years. So to give you an example, so in 2011, Senator Wyden said from the Senate floor that the American people would be shocked and appalled to see how the government was secretly reinterpreting the Patriot Act. So with that information, EFF actually sued under the Freedom of Information Act the government for this secret interpretation. And not only would the government not release one word over a 2-year court battle, they wouldn't even release the number of pages that their interpretation contained. Shortly after Edward Snowden released the first document that showed this secret interpretation, that the government was warping the words of this statute to collect the phone records of every single American, no matter what suspicion or lack of suspicion they had that they were committing a crime. The government was forced by the judge in that case to start releasing thousands and thousands of pages of information about this secret interpretation. And we've seen this time and time again. It's actually, as amazing as the information that we've learned from the leaks are, it's some of the most important information actually came after that, where judges, whether they're on the FISA court or in the federal circuits, felt this public pressure that they had never felt before because people hadn't been paying attention to this issue, and started forcing the government to release all of this additional information. So, a lot of the information on the prison program has been declassified. All of these secret FISA court rulings, well, not all of them, but a lot of them that had happened years earlier, that had shown all of this abuse by the NSA, actually, which the FISA court called systematic abuse. We now know about. I think it's we still have a long way to go as far as accountability goes, but as far as transparency, it couldn't be more night and day. Before Edward Snowden, there was 3 or 4 major NSA cases in the federal courts, all of which were dismissed without ever getting to the merits of the case. So the government got these cases dismissed, whether they're using the state secrets privilege or all sorts of other procedural issues to make sure that judges never actually got to deciding whether or not this actually violated the Fourth Amendment. And now there is a whole slew of new cases going on where the government is already having to defend the merits of the case just less than a year into the cases, or a little more year into the cases. And so there is at least 4 or 5 going on around the country right now, which I think Marjorie is going to talk a little bit more about later, which really could change the game as far as the NSA's powers go, no matter what happens in Congress. And so, the courts are one place where we've seen a lot of changes, and hopefully we'll see a lot more. Congress is another. Right before Edward Snowden came out in 2012, it was actually a couple days before the end of 2012, the Congress overwhelmingly reapproved the FISA Amendments Act, which is one of the 2 laws that the NSA had been using to do a lot of its surveillance. There was barely any debate, there was maybe a day and a half where the Senator Feinstein was saying that there was not enough time to debate any sort of amendments that related to privacy or transparency. Even these amendments where they were bending over backwards to try to facilitate the national security claims that the supporters were making, still none of them passed. The same thing had happened with the Patriot Act a year before. It had passed overwhelmingly when they tried to reauthorized it. And now we've seen, at least in the House, there have been dozens of congressmen who are now forced to go on the record about this, because we all know what's going on, and have indicated that they wouldn't have voted for it or will switch their vote in the future. Whether we believe them as to whether they knew this was going on or not, that's a different story. But now that there is a public record, they are forced to go on record and say whether they are actually for this or not, and I think that's a huge change. There is a bill in Congress right now, the USA Freedom Act, which I also think Marjorie is going to talk a little bit more about, but it is it started off as kind of a strong bill. It's gone from a really strong bill to a really weak bill to a sort of weak bill to a little bit weaker bill. It literally changes every week, and there is a chance it might come up for passage in this lame duck session right after Thanksgiving. Apparently the White House is now trying to stop it. But we have to remember that as soon as the new Congress starts, the Patriot Act is actually up for reauthorization again. So no longer will it be a question of whether or not we can pass the USA Freedom Act. We will have a much, much, much better chance of killing three main provisions of the Patriot Act, the one being the one that the NSA has been collecting all of our phone records on. This will happen in June of next year. They have to vote yes. Both houses have to vote yes if they want to continue to do this type of surveillance. And so I think it's a huge opportunity for the public to express their viewpoint, and it's a lot easier to get a no vote in Congress than it is a yes. So there is a huge opportunity there. Finally, really quick, there has also been a lot of changes on the technical side, which actually I think is probably the most promising. The chances of Congress passing a law that will dramatically reform the NSA are close to zero. But the companies that we communicate online with, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Microsofts, who were all caught essentially colluding with the NSA, are now so upset about these revelations because they threaten their business practices around the world. There are people around the world do not want to use Google or Facebook anymore because they are afraid that they're going to hand over information to the government. And not only that, they were handing over information to the government on one side, and then the government was going and stealing information from these companies on the other. So, they had these broad secret legal powers, and that wasn't enough. They had to go and essentially hack these countries overseas to siphon off even more data. And so now these companies are really fighting back at actually taking a much more adversarial role against the government, encrypting their data links between their servers, protecting our information much, much more than they ever have, which they have been called on to do for years and didn't. But now, again, now that they have to take a public stance, we've seen things change. So with that, I will say that I still am hopeful, even though Congress is obviously broken, that I think that there are so many avenues beyond Congress that hopefully in the next year we will see even more change.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ahmed Ghappour. You were lead counsel for Barrett Brown in the federal criminal prosecution brought against him. What were the charges and how did the case arise? What's the difference between whistleblowing and espionage? What are the penalties for espionage? Are there any defenses? Sorry, let me reread that. What's the difference? Can you all hear me now? Great. I'll go back and read the whole question. No, that's all right. Okay, this works. I don't have that big of a role here. You were lead counsel for Barrett Brown in the federal criminal prosecution brought against him. What were the charges, and how did the case arise? What is the difference between whistleblowing and espionage? What are the penalties for espionage, and are there any defenses? Has the line for whistleblowers been changed during the Obama administration?
Testing. Can you guys hear me? Fantastic. Okay, so I cannot do this in 9 minutes, but I will try my best. If I'm talking too fast, please just do something. So I'm going to start backwards just to frame everything. But whistleblowing, it definitionally is basically the disclosure by a person, usually an employee of a government agency or a private enterprise, to the public or to those in authority of management, corruption, waste, and other wrongdoing, illegalities and such. And the act of whistleblowing, the head-on confrontation of mismanagement, of waste, of illegality, and that disclosure for the mere sake of righting a wrong has to be, in my view, one of the most courageous things that an individual could do. Why is that? Because typically, you're exposing the wrong of your employer or somebody that has power over you. And if we take power and extrapolate it to the most powerful type of employer ever, we've got the US government. And typically you're exposing some wrong. And if we take wrongs and illegalities and extrapolate them to the worst type of wrongs and illegalities, then we've got stuff like mass surveillance, which Edward Snowden has exposed, or torture, as in the case of John Kiriakou, or even extrajudicial killing, which anyone who's seen Citizen 4, towards the end, you kind of have a hint that there's a new whistleblower that's going to start talking about that sort of thing. And it's only then that you can begin to imagine the selflessness that these individuals have and the courage that folks like Dan have and enable them to follow through with something for nothing other than the public good. And so when Dan did what he did, over a decade before I was born, he was doing it for me. My parents hadn't even immigrated to this country, and he was doing it for me. He was doing it for all of us. And so that's why whistleblowing is one of the most powerful and disruptive acts that society can ever sort of produce in the face of oppression. And that's why whistleblowers risk the fate or harshest kind of retaliation. The Obama administration's vehicle for retaliation is the Espionage Act. And so the Espionage Act is basically supposed to punish folks for spying for the enemy, for selling state secrets, for personal gain, for trying to undermine our democratic process and fabric. And the purpose is not to retaliate against those who embarrass you, or to retaliate against those who might be righting your wrongs. The Obama administration uses it to send a message. Challenge us and we will destroy you. Speak the truth to power and it will swallow you whole. And so naturally, you can't get a fair trial under the Espionage Act. Not only because the government controls the narrative. We heard about Jeff Sterling, who's basically non-existent, and the government makes these immediate and unprovable claims about the disclosure and what it's done and what it can do, and essentially puts the fear in our bones about it. But also because the act does not allow a defense for public accountability, nor does it allow a defense for necessity. In other words, I did this, but I did it to prevent a greater wrong. It doesn't allow that. I'm a trial lawyer telling you that. And nor can you bring into trial any sort of discussion of what the motives were of the whistleblower. I did this not for my own personal gain. I didn't do it because I hate the United States. I did it because I love the United States, because I love humanity. Can't do that. And so it doesn't stop there, actually. It actually gets worse. What the Obama administration has done is systematize the criminalization of whistleblowers. And I don't say that merely because of the 10 or so folks that have been prosecuted using the Espionage Act for leaking classified information. 7 of them have been under the Obama administration. I say that because more recently, and as Norm alluded to, the administration has brought whistleblowers into the long war. And what I mean when I say that is that the administration has designated a new national security threat. that it sees as a higher priority than international terrorism, than international drug cartels. The threat is called the insider threat. It's the whistleblower. And so when you create a categorical threat, now you have a broad array of powers to play around with. In the same way that we can cast a wide net to find the next international drug cartel or the next international terrorist incident, we will do the same to prevent the next disclosure and to prevent the next public embarrassment. And because we can't tail every government employee that might be disgruntled, right, we're going after the journalists because they're the pathway to exposure. And so on the note of journalists, and it's sort of ironic that I start my career doing Guantanamo defense work, and I wind up representing journalists, right? It's kind of, I never thought that would happen, but you know, it's the sad irony of where we are today in the United States. And so I'm going to transition into talking about a journalist, Barrett Brown. So Barrett is a journalist, he's a satirist, his work has appeared in The Guardian, Vanity Fair. He's published 2 books, one of which came out while he was in prison. And also at the time of his arrest, and before, a couple of years before that, he had founded a collaborative web publication called Project PM. And Project PM's purpose was to bring people together, to conduct research on publicly available materials that were put forth into the public sphere by whistleblowers, by hackers, by leakers, and so on. And Project PM's reports came to focus naturally on the private military and industrial, intelligence contracting industry. And so in June of 2011, for instance, he and Project PM released an exclusive report about about a surveillance contract called Ramas Coin. And Ramas Coin consisted of sophisticated data mining techniques aimed at Arab countries during the Arab Spring. He also wrote about a remarkable campaign of coordinated disinformation against advocacy groups and journalists that supported WikiLeaks. One in particular that goes by the name of Glenn Greenwald. And so there was a security company that was actually hired and created this whole proposal and strategy on how to take down Glenn Greenwald. Why? Because he was a supporter of WikiLeaks. This is years and years ago. And so in December of 2011, approximately 5 million emails from Stratford Global Intelligence, an intelligence contractor based in Austin, Texas, where I used to live and teach, were hacked by Anonymous. And since they've been posted, by the way, on WikiLeaks, so feel free to check them out. But the files contained revelations about close and perhaps even inappropriate ties between the government, security agencies, and private contractors. And the files were uploaded to a public website, and here comes the criminal conduct. Barrett posted a link to the public website that contained files that had already been disclosed, that had already been put out into the public sphere. The problem with the files, millions of files, right? But some of the files contained credit card numbers because it's a company, right? And you hack the company and you've got all the information. Some of the information contains credit card numbers of some customers. The reason that it contained the credit card numbers in plain text is because the company was negligent and didn't encrypt those files as you should. That should be standardized, right? But based on that cutting and pasting of a link, he was charged with 12 counts related to aggravated identity theft. That and 5 other charges, 2 of which were related to obstruction of justice because he wouldn't turn over his laptop when the FBI came to his house and asked for his sources, and 3 others for making a video taunting the FBI. That we can get to another time. But he faced a possible sentence of 105 years. 105 years for being a journalist and conducting press activities, news gathering activities. The exact thing that we're talking about here, about the independent press, right? About dogged news gathering, about really pushing the envelope and not really standing or trying to break into mainstream media. And so he faced 105 years. And we challenged those charges, specifically the cutting and pasting charges, which were the vast majority of his alleged criminal wrongdoing. And we challenged them on the First Amendment ground. And 2 days after I filed my motion to dismiss, the government dropped 11 out of the 12 charges. 2 days after I filed my motion to dismiss the indictment for violating the First Amendment, for criminalizing news-gathering activity, the government dropped 11 charges. They dropped the charges, so they were no longer there. It was a victory. It was a rare victory. I'm the biggest pessimist on earth. I started out doing Guantanamo work. You cannot imagine. I mean, until today, I don't believe it. Trevor has to remind me. So there you go. That's the happy note I will leave you on, because I think I've hit 10 minutes and 43 seconds, and Bob's giving me that look. So.
I wish we had more time for all of you, but we have a question and answer period where I think we're really going to get deeper into the issues. Hopefully you're going to have more time to speak. So that's why we have the initial time limit. Our last speaker has an important role here tonight, because this is Marjorie Cohn, who is going to summarize what we the people face, what we the people can do, and who are the people that you've referred to. So let me ask you a question. In your January 2014 website blog, you wrote of the Orwellian nightmare of surveillance and how the Supreme Court may ultimately rule on this issue. Would you prefer a constitutional ruling or a reform by Congress? And what are the risks of each solution? And the last part of your question, you wrote in one of your blogs, both Congress, by dutifully rubber stamping the executive's request for almost unlimited snooping powers, and the courts, by affirming those policies, have acquiesced in the unprecedented surveillance of us all. It thus remains for we the people to pressure the government to heed Benjamin Franklin's chilling admonition. As Snowden said, it's important to send a message to government that people will not be intimidated, because if we don't, we will live in nothing less than a police state. This quote from your blog portends the theme of this event. Characterize we the people and what remains for us to do, and are we not the final check and balance in the system?
After Edward Snowden's revelations, the government admitted that it collects metadata on all of our telephone communications. Now, it says it doesn't listen to the content of those communications, but it tracks the identity of the sender, the recipient, the date, the time, the duration, the place, and unique identifiers. And this is called metadata. It's called metadata. There was a public outcry, rein in the executive. Under the Constitution, Congress makes the laws, and the courts interpret the laws to make sure that they're not constitutional. Now, Trevor referred to the USA Freedom Act. The House had passed a bill to rein in the NSA, the National Security Agency, which is the agency collecting all this metadata. But eventually, that House bill was very watered down. And last August, this past August, Senator Leahy, so that was in the House, Senator Leahy in the Senate introduced a bill called USA Freedom Act, which is a vast improvement over the House bill. And so I'm just going to give you a few of the highlights of it, and then talk about some of the problems with it, and then talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and the courts. The USA Freedom Act, and this is the Senate version, would end the bulk collection of our metadata. It would end the bulk collection of our metadata, which is done without a warrant. It's just, it's collected, and the government admits that. This bill would require that tangible things that are sought are relevant and material to an authorized investigation into international terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities, and that they pertain to a foreign power or agent of a foreign power, the activities of a suspected agent of a foreign power who's the subject of an investigation, or an individual in contact with such. So it would be targeted to specific people who are under suspicion. It would require a court order to search the communications of Americans in data collected without an individualized warrant. It would also, right now, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which was established in 1978 in response to or reaction against the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program that J. Edgar Hoover was using to spy on people and target dissidents and targeted Martin Luther King Jr. and others, set up the FISA Court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, a secret court that approves the wiretap requests of the executive, of the president. And until the Bush administration, it had, and even through the Bush administration, it had approved almost every wiretap request. It meets in secret. What the USA Freedom Act would do would be to create an Office of a Special Advocate, which would actually promote privacy interests in the FISA Court's closed proceedings. So there would be someone on the other side, a public advocate, in those proceedings. And then there would be a process for public release of FISA court opinions, which is also, which does not happen now. Internet and telecommunications companies would be allowed to report publicly what they were turning over, and the government would be required to make public reports estimating the total number of individuals and U.S. persons who were subjected to this surveillance, and would require audits by the Inspector General. Now, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which Trevor referred to, has decided to support this bill. It's a vast improvement over prior bills, but it still has some problems. For example, there could be bad faith interpretations of language in the bill, NSA playing word games. And while the clear intent of the bill would be to end bulk collection of call data records and bring more transparency to the NSA, the government may attempt to argue in bad faith that this is not really what it requires. Some people have emphasized that this bill only has extra restrictions for daily call record collection. They've argued that the government can continue to collect bulk information if it just crafts its requests on a weekly or monthly basis. So you see how they could get around it. And while there is significant new transparency required by the USA Freedom Act, much will still remain secret. Now, the special advocate, to kind of argue the other side, argue the civil liberties position inside the FISA court, the problem is that their role is limited. They can only be appointed with the government's approval. They have to have security clearances, and the intelligence community is going to continue to determine which legal interpretations by the FISA court will be made public. So then the question is this bill likely to pass? It's a vast improvement over prior bills. Even though the Republicans now have a majority in the Senate, there still may be, I think, some strong support for this bill, because the House passed overwhelmingly a prior version, which was not quite as strong, and both Republicans and Democrats are very, very concerned about this massive spying, especially because their constituents have put so much pressure on them. Now, the Supreme Court has not actually spoken yet on the constitutionality of this metadata collection, but last year they decided 9-0 unanimously to require a warrant before searching data on cell phones, which is really one of a very, very important development. And I maintain that if the Supreme Court, if this eventually gets to the Supreme Court, which it will, there have been two lower federal court opinions going different ways on this issue of the constitutionality of metadata, then the Supreme Court ultimately will decide the issue. And I think that the ruling in the cell phone case can give us clues, and hopefully will give us clues, about how they would rule on the metadata, the constitutionality of the metadata collection. Just very briefly, there were two lower court judges who ruled on the metadata collection. Judge Lyon of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, who ruled that it's probably unconstitutional, and Judge William Pauley, actually Judge Lyon is a Republican appointee, ruled that the metadata is probably unconstitutional. Judge William Pauley, a Democratic appointee, ruled that the metadata collection is constitutional. So go figure. Now, this, according to Lyon, I'm just going to give you a few little highlights from his opinion. This is what he wrote. The almost Orwellian technology that enables the government to store and analyze the phone metadata of every telephone user in the United States is unlike anything that could have been conceived in 1979, when the FISA court was established. And he called it the stuff of science fiction. He also quoted Justice Sonia Sotomayor's concurrence in the Jones v. U.S. case, in which case the Supreme Court said that the government cannot install and monitor a GPS tracking device on a car. That constitutes a search under the Fourth Amendment, and they have to get a search warrant or an exception to the warrant requirement. And so Judge Lyon, in the metadata case, quoted Justice Sotomayor's concurrence in the GPS case and noted the breadth of information our cell phone records reveal, including familial, political, professional, religious, and sexual associations. Significantly, Lyon noted the government does not cite a single instance in which analysis of the NSA's bulk metadata collection actually stopped an imminent attack or otherwise aided the government in achieving any objective that was time-sensitive in nature. Now, just briefly, and then I'm going to finish with this, the reasoning of the Supreme Court in the cell phone case, saying that when the police seize a cell phone and they want to read the data on it, that constitutes a Fourth Amendment search and they have to get a warrant or some kind of an emergency. Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote for the majority, said modern cell phones as a category implicate privacy concerns far beyond those implicated by the search of a cigarette pack, a wallet, or a purse. He said that the search of cell phone data is materially indistinguishable. Actually, he was responding to the government, which said that it's materially indistinguishable from searches of physical items. And Roberts said, saying that the search of a cell phone is like searching physical items is like saying a ride on horseback is materially indistinguishable from a flight to the moon. This is Chief Justice John Roberts, right? So it's a little nuanced. And Roberts wrote that modern cell phones are now such a pervasive and insistent part of daily life that the proverbial visitor from Mars may conclude that they were an important feature of human anatomy. So, okay, so this is where I think that the reasoning of the cell phone case can predict what they would do in the metadata case. Roberts he writes for the unanimous court. Roberts was concerned that an internet search and browsing history can be found on an internet-enabled phone and could reveal an individual's private interests or concerns, perhaps a search for certain symptoms of disease coupled with frequent visits to WebMD. Now, he could have been describing the NSA metadata collection program, which requires telecommunications companies to produce all of our telephone communications every day. And even though the government claims it doesn't read the content of these communications, it does monitor, as I said, the date, the time, the sender, etc. And Robert said much can be learned from this kind of data. Calls to a clinic that performs abortions, visits to a gay website, a URL such as webmd.com/depression can contain significant information. And so finally, I think that if the court is consistent in its analysis, it will determine that the collection by the government of all of our electronic records implicates the same privacy concerns as the inspection of data on our cell phones. It remains to be seen. The Supreme Court may well determine that the bulk collection of metadata constitutes a search and therefore needs a warrant or an emergency. And just to answer your question, finally, Congress responds to constituents. They respond to pressure. It's one thing they do respond to, which means that it is up to us to pressure our congresspersons and also the White House through letters, through phone calls, through emails, through sitting in their offices, contacting them, demonstrating, writing letters to the editor, not hard to get published, or to help other people get letters on the same topic published by limit them to 150 words, peg them to an editorial or a news story, and make our views known, because it is the responsibility of citizens in a democracy to make sure that the government does not do things in our name that are unconstitutional and that overstep what we the people want. Thank you.
So it's time for, we'll have a few questions. If you have questions, bring them to David Grossoff, our colleague here, who is collecting questions. And so Norman Solomon has this event is a fundraiser for Norman Solomon's group that he coordinates, rootsaction.org. So Norman, if you want to, please take the podium here, or you can do it from your seat. Either way.
Thank you. And by the way, there are sign-up sheets we want to share with all the groups represented here at the podium, at the table. Please circulate the sign-up sheets around. We want to be able to be in touch with you. I want to mention that 2 weeks from now, a delegation of whistleblowers will be in London, and I am lucky enough to be able to accompany them. Colleen Rowley, FBI whistleblower. Kirk Wiebe, who worked very closely with William Binney at the NSA. Kirk will be there. The highest-ranking U.S. official ever to resign in protest of the war in Afghanistan, Matthew Ho. And flying in from Turkey is the British woman who one day in very early 2003, working at the equivalent of the NSA, the GCHQ in England, sat down with her cup of coffee, turned on the computer, and saw a memo from the NSA urging the British intelligence services to assist in wiretapping and bugging crucial swing votes on the UN Security Council to authorize an invasion of Iraq. She was 29 years old. Her name was Catherine Gunn, and unlike thousands of her colleagues, she let her conscience lead the way. She was indicted, and the Blair government began to prosecute her. And it was only when it realized it would have to reveal information about its own internal legal determinations on the legality of that invasion that the charges were dropped. Well, Catherine Gunn, who now lives in Turkey, is going to fly in. And we're going to be speaking at the University of London. We're going to be meeting in small groups with British and other journalists. We're holding a news conference at the Foreign Press Association on November 21st, and more that I can't tell you about right now in public. That's the good news. The necessary, not so great news is that we still have to raise the money to make all this possible. It's being largely funded by rootsaction.org, and I can tell you now that we've set up through the Roots Action Education Fund a tax-exempt way for you to help pay for our food, our transportation, make this visit to London possible, and also we want to do very vigorous media outreach. So magically, in the next minute or so, some hats are going to start passing around here. They're not the 500 hats of Bartholomew Cubbins, but there are 2 or 3 of them. And there are a few ways that you can help, and this is exactly where your contributions will go. To make the visit by Colleen, Kirk, Matthew, and Catherine not only possible, but to strengthen it so we can do more media outreach, so that we're not just pinching pennies, and so we can really reach out to the British and the overseas press corps that's based in London. If you have some cash and you don't care about tax deduction, please throw it in the hat. If you do care about tax deduction, it is tax deductible because the Roots Action Education Fund is a 501c3. And so if you use the words Roots Action Education Fund on the check, then you can write it off as a tax-deductible contribution. If you don't have your checkbook, but you do have a credit card, you can go online right now, and usually you're told to turn off your cell phones. I'm going to invite you to turn on your cell phones, and it's easy to find. It's at the top of rootsaction.org, just rootsaction.org, and you will see at the top a graphic of the Bill of Rights in flames. Okay. So look for the burning Bill of Rights, and right there, there's a button where it says Take Action for Tax Deductible Contribution. So you can do that, and really we will put it to very good use later this month in London. One other thing I do want to mention real briefly, I'm wearing a couple of hats organizationally here. One is rootsaction.org, the other is exposefacts.org, which is part of the Institute for Public Accuracy, and ExposeFacts is also helping make this trip possible. We launched ExposeFacts a few months ago. We are combining activism, journalism, and whistleblowing support. We've had billboards with Dan Ellsberg, a very powerful quote on the billboard in more than a dozen locations in D.C., including near the State Department and the Iraqi Embassy. We now have a 48-foot billboard next to Amazon headquarters in Seattle, asking in big letters, what is the CIA doing on Amazon's cloud? Yes, the CIA has a $600 million contract with Amazon Web Services. But at the core of our activities, combining activism and journalism, is outreach to potential whistleblowers. And we have on our site what's called Secure Drop, which makes possible the anonymous submission of information through the site to exposefacts.org. That would not have been possible. In fact, exposefacts.org would not exist without the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And it's an example of how groups working together can make things happen. So thank you, Trevor. And we're all going to keep organizing, of course, because that's the way we're going to move forward. Again, thanks to all of you for being here tonight.
Excellent. Thank you. So Code Pink has a 1-minute announcement. Oh, please. Sure. Cynthia Papermaster.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Cynthia Papermaster from Code Pink Women for Peace. And wonderful to see you folks here tonight. And I want to thank the panelists, especially Marjorie Cohn, who's one of my favorite writers on the topic of torture accountability. And I'm just going to give you these pink flowers from Code Pink. I just want to say one more word. Did you notice among the panelists that she had some actions that we could take? And I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Code Pink has been with whistleblowing and civil liberties issues from the very beginning. We're out there with Bradley Manning. We're out there about Edward Snowden. But there's a whistleblower you may not know about yet, because there's something rotten in the state of California, and that's the Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant. Dr. Michael Peck, whose name you're going to start hearing more about, is a senior inspector of that plant. After 5 years, he decided to file a recommendation saying to close the plant. He filed that recommendation last year with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They buried his report, and we are supporting what he says, which is to close the plant. Please come see us at our table in the back. We have a ratepayer revolt. We're going to stop paying PG&E, and that is how we're going to get that plant closed, we believe, and there's a convergence of other groups that are working with us. So please join us in this effort, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. A question, please. Here's a question, can go to any of the panelists, really. What is the status of Senator Feinstein's Intelligence Committee's report on U.S. torture policy? Yeah, can you hear me? What is the status of Senator Feinstein's Intelligence Committee's report on U.S. torture policy? The CIA vetted it. They did more than that. And then what happened? This is a good question. Who wants to take this question with a brief response?
I can go really quick and then probably pass it off to Dan. So the Senate wrote over the period of 3 or 4 years a 6,000-page report detailing all of the CIA's torture activities under the Bush administration. And it took years and years to actually get to a vote. The Senate Intelligence Committee declassified it, or voted it to be declassified, over 8 months ago now. And the administration has been dragging its feet and stalling and trying to prevent it from coming out. Part of the reason is the CIA was given basically redaction power over what was in the report. So, there weren't even real names in the report. There were pseudonyms for real names, which are also blacked out, and to the point where senators who've read it have said it's incomprehensible. And so there is actually a real amazing moment right now. Sadly, Mark Udall, the senator from Colorado, lost his seat. He was one of the few members of the Intelligence Committee who was a pro-transparency and was trying to get this information out here. But he actually has an amazing opportunity. He can actually read the CIA torture report on the Senate floor without worry about being prosecuted, even though it's classified because of the speech and debate clause of the Constitution. This actually happened 43 years ago now with Mike Gravel and the Pentagon Papers. So there is precedent for this happening, and Mark Udall has this, just like I said, amazing opportunity, and we may not ever see at least the full report without him doing this. So I would urge everybody to call his office and tell him that he can be a transparency hero, and that he has 2 months to act on this.
Thank you. Ahmed, I have one for you here, and I'm going to actually paraphrase it quite substantially, but what it goes to is your courtroom experience as a practicing attorney against the government and forcing the government to be accountable in the court. This is in the Barrett Brown case. You mentioned your motion to dismiss. Discuss what it feels like to actually be in the courtroom with the government and to force them to respond in a legal way.
Okay. Well, it doesn't really feel like you're forcing them to do much, to be honest, because you're the one getting pushed around, first of all. There was a gag order on the case. They brought in, just briefly I'll talk about this because it has very much to do with the press. A journalist is being tried, faces 105 years in prison for cutting and pasting a hyperlink, which is the kind of charge that is so ridiculous that we're all sort of puzzled as to how that could be in the first place. Yes, and so what happened then was all of a sudden there was a motion to gag the lawyers, right? And the motion to gag the lawyers was on the basis that we were condoning the media's critique of the government's prosecution. And I'm not really sure what that means, to condone media, maybe to stay silent. When we had the hearing and we came into court, they had all these exhibits about how we were condoning the media. And they actually brought in a tweet of mine. And I had actually retweeted Trevor's tweet. And Trevor's tweet retweeted or referred to a Glenn Greenwald tweet. And that tweet linked to an article, and that article said as its headline, which I could not have even seen, retweeting your tweet, if that makes any sense so far, that headline was "The Persecution of Barrett Brown," persecution. And so the judge took issue with the word persecution because it's not a prosecution. It's essentially we're saying it's a persecution, not a prosecution, and so on. And so that was subject to a sidebar for about 3 hours. I mean, I would encourage folks to go read this transcript where we're actually sitting there and they're like, well, we don't want to tweet anymore.
Sorry for getting you in trouble.
Sorry, bro. Well, you know, it happens. And so then there was the issue of discussing whether Barrett, who's a journalist, could write from prison, even though there's a gag order. Could he write from prison? Could he engage in journalistic activities about stuff that doesn't relate to his case, right? And the government was of the position that he criticized the government regularly in all of his writings. And so even if it didn't have to do with his case, because he was up against the United States government, that he couldn't write about the government. I'm talking about very broad stuff like, oh, there was this giant disclosure of NSA materials, let me write about it. Has nothing to do with my case whatsoever. And the government's position was you can't really do that. So the judge kind of, because, you know, he kind of looks at the government and looks at me and then looks at the government and he's like, I think that's in violation of the First Amendment. Actually, like, because critiquing the government is supposed to be what the First Amendment's all about, right? That's what we're all about. So yes, the dropping of charges, you know, it's sort of bittersweet because I wanted the judge to rule against the government. The reason I wanted him to rule against the government is so we can have some sort of precedent or opinion or something, at least in that district. And I'm convinced that the reason that the charges were dropped is so that they can be used again to investigate journalists or folks with who are essentially transmitting information and such. So just to give you the legal theory here is basically once there's information that's stolen, quote unquote stolen somewhere, you can't touch it. So even though this link to this information was tweeted 1 million times by folks all over the country, and I've actually engaged with the government asking them, so is that problematic? And the response was, yeah, but they weren't in our district. If they were in our district, we might do something about it. If you're transferring this stolen information and such, right? So it's sort of, you know, it's sort of bittersweet in that way. The other question, just really quick, you know, and so you oftentimes get to sit down with the prosecutors and with the agents and talk things out. And at some point, I was like, so in the past, when you've gone to trial on charges like this, how do you prove this? How do you prove that like cutting and pasting a hyperlink is a crime in any way, shape, or form? And so let's just say that it's never actually, they've never had to prove it before. Because usually what happens, and this is the real catastrophe of federal prosecution, is you're facing 105 years in prison, you're gonna plea out. There is no way you're going to trial on that. Like you have got to be the most, I don't know. So as a result, they're not used to having to defend their investigative methods. And so, you know, that's a roundabout way of saying, you know, it's very difficult. You don't really get to force the government to do anything. When you do get to force the government to do something, or when you feel sort of empowered, is when you incorporate the media. And that's something I learned doing Guantanamo work. Incorporating the media. I used to work for a place called Reprieve in the UK, and thank you very much. And one thing I learned from the director of Reprieve is that the court of public opinion means everything. And that's why everybody I'm sitting with here on this panel is, I mean, they're my heroes because they are the ones that get things done. I don't do anything. I'm just a clog in the system, sort of, right? And I deliver pizza sometimes. So thank you guys. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you. Marjorie, I have a question for you. Recently in the film Citizen 4, there was a hearing in the German parliament at which William Binney testified. Can you all hear me? And I thought that was an amazing reach of We the People, that there was a global reach to it, that this was a hearing in Germany.
You know, I can't forbear to say, you notice he's never been called before Congress, which has been mentioned innumerable times. He's tried to testify before government committees. So it's great that he testified in Germany. It'd be nice if he could testify over here, actually.
You want to say more? Has he been called as a witness to testify?
Well, no, he has not. He's talked to the staff. Here's you know, Binney is an example of a guy, 37 years, worked for the NSA, one of their absolute top researchers in charge of software of many kinds, including the kind that's used for surveillance now, except that they used his software and stripped all the privacy elements out of it that made it constitutional. whereupon he resigned from NSA. So he then complained about the unconstitutionality of this through channels to the IG, the Inspector General of NSA, and the Inspector General of the DoD. The NSA is part of the Department of Defense. Both totally ignored without any effect whatever. He talked to the staff, in particular one of the minority staff director of the House Intelligence Committee. So he went through channels, all on a classified basis. He did not actually go to the New York Times. But as the troublemaker who had raised these issues of constitutionality and legality, criminality, these actions were criminal for years, as Snowden has demonstrated with documents, he was suspected of being the source to the New York Times, which was prevented from, which unfortunately the sources, the various sources to the New York Times, of which Binney was not one, used only the New York Times. So the New York Times, the president was able to prevail on Bill Keller of the New York Times to sit on the story for a full year, and not only for a year. As James Risen, who wrote the story, said, they would never have printed it if it were not for the case that he told them he was going to go ahead and print it in a book. So they went ahead and finally printed it after a year, after the election, a very narrow election, giving us 4 more years of George W. Bush, and got a Pulitzer Prize for it. But meanwhile, Binney, having not given it to the New York Times, is then steps. His shower door is opened. He was sitting in there. He's a diabetic amputee. So he's naked and with one leg in his shower, opens the door to find an FBI man pointing a gun at his head, naked, allowing him to dry under gunpoint with his entire family, who had previously had guns pointed at them, his wife, opened the door and so forth. Interrogated for 8 hours. They allowed him to dry off, etc. Interrogated him for 8 hours. Took all of his computers, most of which, and thumb drives and everything else, a big computer man, most of which he has never gotten back, and removed his clearances. He was now retired. And clearance now, for him, meant an income of $300,000 a year. Because without the clearance, you can't work at the level he was working. So he lost his entire income, except for his retirement income, which he gained. All the other NSA people who had left or resigned over the constitutional issue had the same kind of FBI raids against them, including Tom Drake, but including Diane Rourke, the House staff expert that they had consulted. And as they said, when Snowden came out, this was what they were talking about. They had failed by working through channels to get any of it out. Snowden had succeeded, of course, at the cost of exile for the rest of his life, and they're looking over his shoulder to see whether he'll be assassinated through the rest of his life. So the notion that both Secretary Kerry and Hillary Clinton, and basically the president, have all said that Ed Snowden didn't do it right. Yes, we're glad to have some of that information out, but he didn't do it right. He should have gone through channels. The people who went through, Snowden learned from the people who went through channels. He looked at the Manning trial. He looked at what happened to Binney and the others, against whom, as I say, no charges were brought. There was no basis for them, but their incomes, they're totally destroyed. So the moral of that is that, as what Binney drew, and the others as well, that they hadn't done it right, actually. They did by going through channels. Snowden did it right.
That's a good answer. Where I wanted my question to go, actually, was, are we expanding the notion of we the people when the German parliament, the German people, are asking questions about our government? So we have one more question, and then the last word will be from Rabbi Michael Lerner's representative. Oh, pardon? Wasn't the question to Marjorie? Well, it was the. Yeah.
I couldn't have come close to Dan's magnificent answer to that question.
We want to give the panelists as much more opportunity as we can to speak. Here's one that I thought was really interesting. Pierre Omidyar, he founded Intercept, which is a wonderful news organization, internet. I'll read the question, but needs a little bit of interpretation. The Intercept, funded by billionaire Pierre Omidyar, who blocked PayPal payments to WikiLeaks, seems very iffy to me. Do you think Greenwald and others really checked him out before starting a new media venture? So it's a question about Pierre Omidyar, and it's a media question, and I think it's fair, given our free flow of ideas here, to ask a question like that. Trevor, have you got an answer for that question?
So, full disclosure, First Look Media, which Pierre is also, is the parent organization of First Look, has given money to Freedom of the Press Foundation as well. I think that Glenn has said repeatedly that they have been given full editorial control over The Intercept, what gets published, what's not, and actually, as proof of that, if one of their latest stories is a very detailed criticism of Omidyar and the inner workings of The Intercept. They had recently had a top editor leave. And so, I have always trusted Glenn's opinion about his editorial freedom, and he has always made that paramount in who he works for, and it's really the only rule that he has, that he can publish whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And, I think if there is ever a situation where that is not the case, then we will know probably almost immediately.
I think the import of the question perhaps goes to the Intercept's treatment of Assange and WikiLeaks. Is there any controversy there?
Glenn and Laura Poitras are probably WikiLeaks' two biggest public supporters, so I don't know.
Fine. Well, I wanted to read that question. Okay. So we have one more quick one, Ahmed. And this is a question that goes to amending the Espionage Act. Just briefly give what your proposed amendment would be to the Espionage Act. Any amendments?
I think that, quite frankly, I think the individuals on my right are probably the right people to answer that. I would eliminate the Espionage Act.
That's fine. Question was directed to you, but to Marjorie.
Well,
that's
thanks
fine.
for that. But Marjorie, would you please, or Dan?
Well, Marjorie is pointing to me here because I'm not a lawyer, I'm a defendant, and I was the first person ever to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act for a non-espionage act. The Espionage Act, so-called, was intended clearly by Congress in 1917, in the first weeks of our entry into World War I, against spies who give information essentially secretly to a foreign power, especially in wartime. It was not meant as a bill to abridge freedom of speech, as a matter of fact, to Americans and to Congress and so forth. It's at the time of my trial, or actually right after my trial, there were major law review articles by the leading scholars of the First Amendment at that time, of the Espionage Act, Mel Nimmer, Edgar Schmidt, Benno Schmidt, and Harold Edgar, Benno Schmidt, and Mel Nimmer, all of whom said that the acts, to quote Nimmer, if I may, the acts of which Daniel Ellsberg is charged either are not criminal under the Espionage Act, or, if so interpreted, the act is unconstitutional. And unhappily, those were very authoritative statements at the time. They weren't final. It's the Supreme Court who decides these issues. But as an opinion, and for reasons that as you put it very well. I made a note of it. To criminalize whistleblowing, under the Espionage Act, classified whistleblowing in particular, is a major abridgment of freedom of speech, of just exactly the kind of speech that the public needs to have and to protect in order to be a republic and a democracy, and to hold the executive branch accountable when it abuses power in the area of war and peace, especially, and what they now called Homeland Security. So that it's a major, and I'm very sorry to see that constitutional issues are almost never raised by the media in this connection when they report on the various trials which have been held, which have mostly been settled by plea bargains. Only one trial has led actually so far to a conviction by a jury. That was Samuel Loring Morrison, same charges I faced in 1985 when the Supreme Court denied cert. So as I think Norman pointed out, the Supreme Court has never ruled, ever, on the constitutionality of this use of the Espionage Act, which doesn't discriminate between spying for a foreign enemy in wartime and informing the American public. So it's a major, we can't count on the current Supreme Court, of course, noticing that this is unconstitutional. At least we can't count on 5 justices deciding. Probably we'll get 4 in agreeing with Schmidt and Edgar and Nimmer earlier that this is unconstitutional, but 5 very hard. The effect of that is then to cut off not only the anonymity of these sources, but if their anonymity fails, as it very easily can now with the kind of surveillance that's being held, whistleblowers can now expect, after the Obama administration in particular, to face prosecution even for revealing government crimes, as Edward Snowden was revealing, as Tom Drake and Binney and the others were reporting, though not to the Times, as some people reported at the Times. One person, you mentioned the torture report. Now, that is very clearly a candidate for leaking. Yes, Udall or others could do it without any question of prosecution coming up. But, and he's off the committee anyway, he's out of Congress anyway, but he has a career ahead of him, maybe wants to come back at various times, and it would affect his career, though not prosecution. That is more than enough to keep everybody in Congress, in the Senate, from telling the truth on these matters, with the one exception that I know of Mike Gravel. I remember saying to Gravel after the failure of the 2006 election to produce any change on these matters, I said, Mike, do you think that Congress now, the currently, is extraordinarily cowardly? And he said, no, ordinarily cowardly. He said that's the way they were 40 years ago. That's the way. Okay. Does that mean, though, that nobody can, who has access to that thing, no staff person, no secretary, nobody, none of the officials who know that it's criminal will take the lead of Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden, both of whom, by the way, could have done what they did totally anonymously and get it out? You're talking about 6,000 pages of acts that are as criminal as acts can be, not just in domestic law, but in international law, treaties that the U.S. has signed, the Constitution, Fourth and Fifth Amendments. Couldn't be more unconstitutional, illegal law under international law and domestic law. Years of it. 6,000 pages. Now, Obama says he would like it all to be out, like Dianne Feinstein. Fat chance, because if that got out, of course, it would shine a very unkind light on his refusal to prosecute anybody, except one person. John Kiriakou, is sitting in prison right now because he revealed the name of a torturer. No one prosecuted for torture, totally criminal. There are people who will argue, well, torture was necessary, did this, it did that. And there's plenty of people, in fact, a large portion of the public, who will say the torture was necessary. But whether it's legal or not is not a gray area. Totally criminal. No prosecutions, but one person prosecuted for revealing government crime. That is not the way the system of the Bill of Rights and of the separation of powers and of a republic and a democracy is supposed to work. It is not working. It is broken. And you asked finally, how should the Espionage Act be amended? Well, actually, clauses D and E of 18 U.S.C. 793, I know that very well because I was the first person prosecuted under them, should be rescinded. And if they're not going to do that, which they are not, it should be amended, the Espionage Act should be amended to allow what Joachim Benkler of Harvard Law School calls a public accountability defense, otherwise a public interest defense, so that a person with such charges could do what none of the people tried have yet been able to do under the Espionage Act, and that is to argue that their motives were in the public interest, that the effect was in the public interest, that no harm was done, no harm was intended, et cetera, et cetera. None of that can be raised in court. So again, now under the Espionage Act, which is clearly unconstitutional as a restriction of speech in the absence of such a defense. So when Hillary Clinton and who might be our next president, and it could be even, though I know a friend of mine will disagree, could be even worse, and than Hillary Clinton, will not rescind the actions of Obama in this case, who has indicted 3 times as many people as were indicted under all previous presidents put together, starting with me. They should amend the act in this form to allow those defenses and make the act finally constitutional and give us a chance at a democracy.
Thank you. So we have a last word from one of our wonderful co-sponsors, Network of Spiritual Progressives, Neil Penn.
Thank you. On behalf of the Network of Spiritual Progressives, we have a campaign dealing with the undue influence of big money in government that goes beyond that. It's called the Environmental and Social Responsibility Amendment. That means if it gets passed, every 10 years, all large corporations will have to appear before a panel of ordinary citizens to determine whether they have the right to have their license renewed. That won't include being environmentally responsible, doing right by workers, and being a good public citizen. If not, the plug gets pulled. Visit our website, Network of Spiritual Progressives, for a detailed version of the campaign and how you could get involved.
Thanks so much. So that concludes the event. Thanks all of you for coming out and being part of the new media. We were on live stream tonight. There'll be a YouTube video, and you were all here, and you're part of the new media. And thanks to every one of our panel, individually, collectively, brilliant, honest. Thank you again. Bravo.